Welcome back to my channel. I'm Nikki and this video is all about pastry. I'm going to talk about the different recipes that there are when it comes to making a pie crust or a tart shell. So if you don't know the differences and if you would like to find out more about technique and different baking methods, then stick around because I'm going to cover all your pastry basics. Now this is quite a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to be splitting this video into different episodes. So I'm going to start with this one as an introduction. I'm going to cover the main differences between the different recipes for pastry. We have three main categories, and of course they have a French name. They're usually pâte something. Pâte means dough in French. So at the very bottom of our scale in terms of richness, we have pâte brisée.
So pâte brisée is the least sweet pastry. Therefore, it's a multi-purpose dough that you can use for savory dishes and also sweet desserts. And you might have seen this in recipe books as short crust pastry or just short crust. Now let's move on to the sweet short crust pastries. First up is pâte sucree. You can see that it has a lot more sugar in the dough with respect to the pâte brisée. You might find that it has possibly some vanilla, some ground almonds, and of course we have eggs in this recipe. And the sister to pâte sucrée is pâte sablée, and this is almost a cookie-like dough. And it's widely used as a base for many desserts. And the recipe is very, very similar. Both excellent options for sweet short crust pastry.
In my video, I will also show you the two techniques that there are for making pastry. There's the crumbing method and the creaming method. And because of the differences in the ingredients that each of these pastries have and the technique that you use to make them, then in the end you will have different textures. So I will be talking about those as well. So let's get started.
So let's talk about the multi-purpose pâte brisée. I love this recipe because it's so easy to throw together. Our dry ingredients are only flour, some sugar and some salt. I'm quickly going to stir this and then move on to my wet ingredients. My wet ingredients are actually cold. I have some cold butter that I just took out of the fridge. And I'm just gonna try and cut it into tiny pieces, tiny cubes, so that I can incorporate it using either my fingers, a pastry cutter, or a pastry scraper. I'm doing everything by hand in this episode. You can also use a food processor if you have one. But today I'm using my hands and a couple of tools that I actually want to talk to you about. Now we want to make sure that the butter is cold, so you can actually do this step the day before and just keep the butter in the fridge all cubed up. It's important that the butter is cold because this is what makes the texture of this pastry so incredibly flaky. So at this point, I've done my prep, so I'm ready to put everything together. I have my dry ingredients here, and I'm gonna dump all of this butter in. Now here I have a pastry scraper and a pastry cutter. And for this pastry, I'm using the pastry cutter. Now this is a tool that I would recommend that you get if you make a lot of pies, a lot of tarts, because it prevents you from using your hands too much. You have all these tiny blades that cut into the butter as they move around the dry ingredients. So that means your butter stays nice and cold, and that prevents it from melting too much into the overall dough. Brisée means broken, and that translates to you having some visible bits of butter in the dough. And this is what makes this pastry super flaky. So in general, you want to keep that butter cold, and this is a great tool to achieve that while still incorporating it into a very fine kind of mixture. Now I'm just getting everything off. It's very easy to clean as well. And look at those visible bits of butter. This is what you want. You don't want huge chunks of butter. If you do, you can break them up a little bit with your finger, but this texture is good enough for the pastry. And at this point, we are ready to put the dough together. And for that, we need some sort of liquid, and I have some water here. Some people use a little bit of acid coming from, for example, lemon juice, vinegar. And by the way, you might find recipes that call for shortening and nut butter. And this is supposed to give you a way flakier crust. So if you feel like experimenting with recipes, you can try half butter, half shortening, and so on. I do like the taste of butter in my pastry, so I decided to just use all butter. And you want to add cold water. I would do 1 tablespoon at a time and check for the consistency of the dough. If I can press it with one hand and it holds together, then this is done. You don't want to add too much water. Now I'm gonna bring all of this together on my workbench. You can use your hands at this point. Just try not to work the dough too much. I'm just pressing from the sides and from the top, trying to build a nice little ball or circle. You can use a scraper also to help you get all of these bits together. Clean up the bench a little and just keep applying pressure to the whole thing. It will come together if you added the water properly. So what happens next? The dough can't really be rolled into anything because it's a bit overworked and it would just fall apart if you really try to do that at this point. So as any other pastry dough, later on in the video, you will see that you have to chill them before you roll them. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So before I put it in the fridge, I cover it with some cling film, some plastic wrap. Make sure it's nicely sealed. Or you can also chill overnight or even a couple of days. It keeps rather well in the fridge. So this is nice and ready. You can see that I'm flattening it out because it's easier to roll later on this way. So this is ready for the fridge, and I'm gonna move on to the next pâte. Next up we have pâte sucree, and this one calls for a different technique with respect to the other two pâtes. I'm gonna use the so-called creaming method, which means creaming butter and sugar together. So you don't have to be super careful with the butter on this one. My butter is not exactly at room temperature, so I have to work it a little bit before I can incorporate it with the sugar. So it should be relatively soft. And I'm gonna add icing sugar. And you might have already noticed that we're using icing sugar instead of regular sugar. And that's because this pastry is really tender. So this is just adding to those textures that make each pastry very unique and special. So we're just trying to incorporate the butter and sugar. We're not really building air into this. We're just trying to make everything nice and smooth and ready for our next ingredients. I'm adding 1 egg and a little bit of vanilla. This is completely optional, by the way, the vanilla. But I'll be using this for some chocolate tarts later, so I thought, why not? So I'm just gonna beat these together until I form a nice and smooth paste. And this might already remind you of cookie dough. And it's true, you could even use a stand-up mixer if you didn't want to do this by hand. I just suggest that you use the paddle attachment as you would for any cookie recipe. And you can add a little bit of flour at a time to see how you get on. In my video, I actually decided to transfer the whole thing onto my workbench and just finish off there. Obviously, if you're doing this in a mixer, you don't have to do this. You don't have to worry about this. But if you're doing it by hand, just see where you feel comfortable. So I'm just gonna dump the rest of the flour and add in the center this paste. And the reason we do this is so that you don't add too much of that flour. I don't know if you've ever experienced that you follow a recipe exactly the way it is and you end up with a very dry dough. And that could be because in your environment you don't actually require as much flour. But things change from kitchen to kitchen, as you know, so you have to be a bit careful in the way in which you add the flour so that you don't end up with a very runny dough or a very dry one. So again, I'm using this very handy dough scraper just to help myself incorporate all of that flour, and at the same time I'm bringing the dough together. Once you see that a ball is forming, then you can just use your hands and repeat the same process as with pâte brisée. You're applying pressure to the sides and to the top, but because we're not worried about the butter temperature, we can actually roll this one. And this is slowly taking shape. I'm actually gonna roll this into a log. You can also do a disc if that's what you want, but I wanted to show you a different technique for rolling out dough in the next episode. So I'm shaping this already, again covering it with some plastic and chilling it before I roll it for at least 1 hour. And this is ready to go in the fridge. Now let's move on to the next pastry, the pâte sablée. And this is kind of a combination of the last two recipes that we've seen in this video. We have cold butter, just like we did for pâte brisée, but the ingredients are very similar to pâte sucree. So it's nice to see what the different methods actually do to a similar recipe. You will find that because of the crumbing method, this pâte sablée has a very crumbly texture. But thanks to the ingredients and mostly the egg and the extra sugar, then you will see a very nice and golden pastry in the end that has a very sandy texture, almost cookie-like, that pastry chefs just love. And this is something that you will see in a lot of recipes, especially for tarts and sweet desserts. Now let's get back to the recipe here. We have again the cold butter and the dry ingredients. And you can see that I'm not using the pastry cutter anymore. I'm using this pastry scraper or dough scraper. And it's the same goal. We're just trying to cut into the dough as quickly as we can without using our hands. And we will stop when we reach a certain size of those butter bits, and you will see that it comes together already because of that egg in the recipe. Basically, if you add egg, you don't really need the water as you did for the pâte brisée. So be very careful. If you find that it's too dry and it's not coming together, feel free to add some cold water. So similar technique, we're just trying to make sure the dough comes together with our hands. Just pressing the sides, pressing the top. Because the butter is cold, we don't want to overwork this dough. And I'm gonna shape this into a nice disc for later and roll it out in the next episode. And that's a wrap for this episode, pun intended. We've covered the 3 main recipes for pastry, and we're gonna be using those later I know it's a bit of a cliffhanger, but I wanted to cover as much as I could without making this video too long.
So stay tuned for the second episode where I will be covering different methods for rolling dough, for lining tart cases, and also for baking. I will be doing a couple of experiments in the baking area, so don't miss that. And obviously, if you don't want to miss out on any of my content, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel and don't forget to like this video. And if you have questions on this video, just post them on the comment section and I will take a look. Thank you for watching, and until next time.